and to all people, you know, and so there's this little resonance of Julian and St. Julian. Yeah, so I love this Paul.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I'm also fascinated by this entry of grace through the body of the Black Mother. In the tension that you described, Angela, between M. Sean Copeland's notion of black flesh becoming a sacrament as a vehicle through which God reveals God's self. I'm thinking about Dolores Williams' womanist approach to that same idea, where Williams is troubling this idea of, in this particular case, does the Black woman in the story have agency in accepting herself as a vehicle of God's grace? And how does, if the answer is no, does that not put us back in the bind of surrogacy, even in relationship to divinity? And Williams would say that that would be a superfluous notion of using the surrogacy of the Black woman to bring in some type of divine moment, recognizing that paradox is often the way in which God may operate in relationship to the human condition. She troubles that redemptive suffering model. And so I wonder sometimes, do you see any resolution to that in Flannery in terms of the agency of the characters in being the vehicle of grace?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Did everybody heard the question? Okay. Yeah, the idea that, I'm sorry these mics are not working today. The idea brought in by womanist theologian Dolores Williams, that in the case of the Black woman in this story, who is the agent of grace for Julian, maybe she doesn't want to be the agent of grace. And the fact that she has not accepted that role, is that not in some way having her play this unfortunate role of the surrogate again, and being used really for the purposes of converting a white man? And it's a really interesting and provocative question. I will say that O'Connor's stories are full of people that serve as agents of grace, and they do so unwittingly and unwillingly. And most of them are white, actually, the majority of them. And they're people who are profoundly flawed in all sorts of ways. You know, there's one in a doctor's waiting room who is an angry young adolescent who throws a book and hits a woman in the head with it, and then ends up really going psychotic in the office. Right. She doesn't want to be an agent of grace. Quite the contrary. She really wants to hit this woman with the book and kill her. Her name, by the way, is Mary Grace. She has it doesn't matter whether she wants to be an agent of grace or not. She is. And so most people in the world, and this, I think, this is O'Connor's, spiritual economy, is that most of us don't know if and when we're serving as agents of grace for somebody else. We do this unknowingly, blindly, what fools we mortals be, just sort of going through our lives, and unbeknownst to us, we do act as agents of grace for other people, even sometimes when we are really trying to be mean and terrible to other people. Yeah. And so there is this sense of a God who is a divine providence that is bringing good out of evil, bringing good out of our worst motivations and our worst moments in some kind of way. So it does get complicated in the source in this story, because the agent of grace is a Black woman, and we've been talking about all of these various ways to see. But I will say that O'Connor is colorblind in that respect, that everybody is ignorant in terms of their agency.
See, I'm not sure I accept the idea of agent of grace. And the Black woman being an agent of grace. I do accept the idea that God can use the most mean-spirited action on the part of a person to bring a person to a moment of conversion. I do believe that. But I'm not sure I would characterize that person as being an agent of grace. For me, an agent of grace would be, for example, Stephen, who, as he's being stoned, cries out with his last breath, "Father, forgive them." kind of foreshadowing the word, remembering the words of Jesus. As he's crucified, his first words are, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That I understand being characterized as an agent of grace, because there's the pronouncement of forgiveness to those who don't deserve it. But to characterize the woman in the story as an agent of grace is now I'm not yet quite getting it, and it may mean that I'm just missing a point there. Yeah.
Well, I think that your reading of the mother, the Black mother, goes against that notion that she's an agent of grace, because you're showing that moment where she loses her temper and was so angry and throws the pot out. It's a loaded moment, loaded by history, and it's a very human response to that's not theological. So, and I think in Mary Grace's case too, I don't agree that she's psychotic. I think she's responding in a very human way to the way that her mother and Mrs. Chopin are exchanging cliches about, like talking about her in the third person. Like it's a very human response. So I do think about this documentary that just came out with Toni Morrison, where I'm not certain when the interview took place, but she's saying, racism affects white people very in a very detrimental way. Like she says, get me out of it. Like you've got to deal with that.
She says race affects people.
Racism affects white people. Yeah. So I was thinking about this notion of one ounce of pressure too much, and the white Julian's mother is suffering from high blood pressure, like that sort of pressure. I think that she has a kind of physical response. I mean, she's suffering physically from having her racist notions, and in a way that Julian and the mother are battling it out. I think they are kind of battling it out over how racism has affected them. They're having to battle it out without the help of a Black character. I don't know if that's making sense, but.
Yes, so grace almost always comes about as a result of some kind of violent conflict, sometimes violent physically, sometimes violent, linguistically, people fighting against one another, absolutely.
But I see her harness being like a sort of just really key witness to the way white racism of white people affects white families.
Yeah, she's very good at racist white ladies. She lives with one, that's her milieu, that's her culture, and she's so good at getting exactly the tone of voice and the kinds of condescending actions, like the giving of the penny to the little boy. She understands that idiom and that language entirely. And so, she's a great studier of white racism and the ways in which it plays itself out in the world. That's amazing, and one of the things she does so well.
I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Chapman, and bring into the context of the Civil Rights Movement when King writes that letter from the confines of Birmingham jail, and he speaks about the question of morality when it comes to the inextricable bond of means to ends, and how the ends are coexisting with the means. And keeping in consideration what Orson Spillers says is the property kinship constellation, that is the legacy of slavery, and how this white man is constantly titillating at that and kind of breaking the Black mother's consent of what she wants her child to be doing, and who she wants her child to be interacting with. And keeping in mind this question of morality, how much more moral would it have been for the Black woman to, if she did get the win, to act in what a lot of us would assume to be grace now, and maybe done something more non-violent? How much more moral would it have been if that would just preserve that moral institution of the property kinship constellation? And for an example, when King goes to Albany, Georgia, and the police chief is treating everybody non-violently, not like the same way that Will Connor treats people, inside Birmingham. And King says, in the same, just as much as we cannot use immoral means for moral ends, we should not be using moral means, non-violence, for immoral means, which was segregation. There, so it's just, if you guys had all the answer, I would love that, but how much more moral would it have been if she did respond violently? And that would just allow that immoral situation to keep going.
Yes.
You quoted the man.
That's a great question. I don't think I could give as eloquent a response as was the question.
That's right.
But I can say that's in 1949, Howard Thurman, the great theologian, wrote a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. He wrote that book, and Martin Luther King Jr. always had a copy of that book in his briefcase. And in one of those chapters called Deception, Howard Thurman says is that Jesus teaches people, right, who are marginalized Jews living under Roman oppression, how to deal with their oppression without succumbing to hating the Romans, and also without succumbing to becoming a lie or a deception. So deception becomes the means by which weak people learn to act in front of their oppressors. And while Thurman says that that is an understandable approach, right, when you have to survive, he concludes that it's no longer a viable approach because he says the penalty for engaging in deception is ultimately to become a deception. So what does he say is the alternative? Is to become honest and truthful in all of your engagements with the oppressor without succumbing to hatred. So yes, the woman on the bus, the black woman, she fails the test because she allows her anger, right, to move her into a direction where she no longer is able to do what King would want, to turn that person into a friend. She passed the first test with regard to deception. She was truthful. We don't want your pennies anymore. But when she responds with the pocketbook in the physical confrontation, she fails the moral test of anger, which got now the best of her. So I mean, it's a great question. That's what my grandmother always taught us growing up: good, better, best. Do not rest till your good is better and your better is best. And so there was a better way. And that's what King would always push the black community as they struggled against segregation. Don't settle for the good way. Right? Just find the better way. And the better way is to resist it without giving into the impulse to hate.
I want to thank Anthony for that question and all of the students spending their Saturday afternoon with us. If you could just stand and be recognized if you're a student at Fordham, I think that's important. Yeah. I would go at it a different way. And I would think that this is a politics of morality that's emerging between, or potentially a politics of morality that's emerging in your question. So that moral systems after the emergence of the Atlantic world and chattel enslavement are in entanglement, they're in contact, and they're in exchange. And so the question is, in contact and exchange, what is the surplus value of the exchange in the moral codes that are happening? And I think King makes a wager with nonviolence that the surplus good in not reacting with more violence, right, can move the movement towards its higher ideal. So the question is that what King does with that surplus, is that practical? And does theology work as a way of signifying that practicality so that itself is the deception by which the civil rights movement proceeds? So it's not necessarily, to me, an escape from the deception in which you become the deception, right? But it's a question of whether or not the community has done the wrestling with determining for themselves what is moral in that moment. And I say that because King is oftentimes the protector, and those who walk with King are oftentimes the protector of another type of process of achieving justice and freedom. You know, people are glad when King shows up and Stokely Carmichael doesn't show up. They're glad when King shows up and Malcolm X doesn't show up, or Ella Baker shows up, right? And so I'm wrestling from a perspective of agency and producing the morality. And so King to me is just as much as Flannery O'Connor, Angela, in your work, is an ambiguous figure in terms of what she presents with the question of race. King to me is an ambiguous figure. It doesn't come to me as easily as I think the nation state would want us to. Remember how they used Fannie Lou Hamer, right, in the organization of, and the way that they got the votes, and they didn't get the vote that they want, and like King was like, well, this is necessary for us to move in this way. And so this is a very interesting thing. The blues perspective, I think, is a different moral compass that doesn't necessarily take nonviolence or violence as the way forward, but it's an alternative move into a different kind of vision of relationship with the land that people were involuntarily forced to work. So yeah, I'd say that.
I think another piece of genius in O'Connor's story is the little boy. Yes. She would never have done what she did if it weren't for the fact that her little boy was with her. And at one point when he wants to go over and play with Julian's mother, he wants to play peekaboo, and she grabs him as if she was protecting him from contagion. So she thinks of that white woman, and it was so instructive to think about this in the context of Emmett Till. This person can destroy my child, and there's no way I'm going to let her treat him in a way, even though she slaps him, she's his mother, she can do that, but she's going to make sure that she protects him as much as possible. So introduce now this into the moral equation, irrational mother love, which is what this mother has. And if we think about this against the natally dead mothers that Morrison talks about, women who were not allowed to keep their children, they would be sold, out from under them. They would have to have children by their white masters. Their whole sense of being, and this is very interesting in terms of contemporary conversations about feminism, that white feminism is a very different thing than feminism is for black women. And even the abortion question is very different for black women than it is for white women. Coming from a culture and a world in which you were not allowed to keep your child, abortion is not something that is necessarily thought to be for the common good. So I think O'Connor is very wise to introduce into this story the complexity of the fact that the child is there. And that's why she's motivated to do what it is that she does. And yeah, sure. I mean, well, yes, I suppose it would have been better, she would have been better behaved if she would have just put up with what was happening. But I think she thinks no. I think we need to say, she needs to say no to this, no in thunder to what has been done to her and generations before her.
Great question. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Any other questions or observations that you'd like to make? Yes?
I was especially fascinated by Julian's character because he misconstrued ideas, that's what allows growth? That we need a punch in the face for that to happen? Or is it just, I guess, more calm?
Well, that's a great question. For me, you need the punch in the face. And that's why I read this through the lens of the New Testament, especially the Gospels, which give this account of the conflict that Jesus has with the religious leaders, the Pharisees. Now, the reason why there's this tension is because the Pharisees are the religious elite, and they have this notion that they know best. And when Jesus comes and presents a vision of relationship to God in a way that conflicts with theirs, right? Then they're on the collision course, right? Which ultimately is going to lead to his crucifixion. So the slap in the face that Jesus has to give, the metaphoric slap in the face that Jesus gives to the Pharisees is to expose their hypocrisy. So what does he do? He intentionally heals people on the Sabbath, yes, because he knows it's going to provoke them. Mm-hmm. He intentionally goes out of his way looking for confrontations for the purpose of exposing their insincerity. And so that's what it takes. When you deal with a self-righteous, condescending, arrogant spirit, the only way to expose it is that metaphoric, slap in the face. I think that's a great question.
And it's very interesting that often that comes about in O'Connor by meeting your other self. As soon as he sees her, he says, there's something familiar about her that he couldn't quite recognize. And this happens over and over again in O'Connor stories. People run into a serial killer, and there's something familiar about that serial killer. And, of course, the serial killer ends up killing her. But there is this sense in which, in some ways, you're encountering your worst nightmare, or you're encountering what you most fear in yourself, this manifestation of your worst self that's outside of you, and that leads to this violent recognition, really, of the dark side of yourself. She very deliberately likes to set up exactly that kind of dynamic. So, that actually is a great question, great last question for us to end with. What I would like to do before we all leave today is, first of all, thank our panelists who have been just amazing today. So grateful for their time in thinking about this story, going outside of their disciplines and writing these beautiful papers and creating such a fascinating conversation. Really, this wouldn't happen without them. I also want to thank all of the people who have supported this programming, my colleagues at the Kern Center for American Catholic Studies, especially the director, Christine Finzi, and Maria Terzulli, who's in the back, who has set up so much of what's been happening today and which will happen tonight as well. I want to thank America Magazine, who has co-sponsored this, and I want to thank the Mary Flannery O'Connor Trust, which has given us funding for this. And also, of course, I want to thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I really do encourage you to come to the play this evening. As I mentioned, I've seen it twice before. I saw it a couple of years ago with another company, and then I saw this company do it last weekend. And it was even better than I remembered it being, having seen it several years ago. It's so powerful. And Karen talking about it right now is such a treat. It's so much in keeping. Having that chorus, they're like a Greek chorus, those voices that surround Julian and his mother. And it has the power, the combination of those players, the division of those lines, and O'Connor's language. It's like watching a Greek tragedy unfold. So it's short. It's 50 minutes, so it hits you like Greek tragedy hits you. So I really recommend that you come, and also it's such a treat to get to talk to the actors afterwards. So please join us at 7 o'clock in Leonard Theater, and thank you for coming to this today.